On to Dinamo Zagreb, though, and sort of a little bit of background about the club. Most people will know that they're a Croatian football team, but they're the most successful club in Croatia with 21 domestic titles, league titles, that is, 15 Croatian Cups, 6 Super Cups. And they were also the winners of the 1967 Intercities Fairs Cup, which was sort of a precursor to the UEFA Cup and the Europa League. But it was actually this season that they got furthest in the Europa League, the furthest they've ever got, which was as quarterfinalists. They were knocked out by Villarreal, of course, who have now made it to the final, getting past Arsenal. But it's been a fascinating ride over these past few years. I remember watching a couple of games of them in the Champions League group stage. It may have been last season or the season before, but the Stadion Maximir is just such an iconic stadium. It's very harsh and severe, very brutalist, but it's got a very passionate fan base, and it's as you were saying, Ben. The more that you sort of researched into this club, the more that you recognize that this is a story which needs telling. I don't know was there anything sort of the background of the club when you were doing your research for the Yozak interview that really stuck out to you about sort of about Dinamo Zagreb?
I mean, I just think like obviously coming from like a Western perspective, you don't realize how big these clubs are. Dinamo, Hajduk, and the two Serbian clubs, Partizan and Red Star Belgrade. They're hugely popular in Yugoslavia and the Balkan region. And in terms of like, I think what was nice to discover when I talked to Romeo is that he actually worked with Luka Modrić as well. That was kind of his first steps into management, and the fact that the first sort of high profile player that he worked with as a youth coach was Luka Modric and Vedran Luka, and those type of players was kind of a cool little insight. I managed to get a cool little insight about Modric as well in the process.
Very nice. Obviously, you're talking about Luka Modric and Vedran Choluka there, who are, of course, I mean, Luka Modric is a global name, but Vedran Choluka, most people sort of in English football would recognize him as being a player who played for Spurs towards the end of the 2000s, beginning of the 2010s. But obviously, have played their part in the Croatian footballing sphere for the past 15 years or so. The one thing about Dinamo Zagreb that I think a lot of people may neglect to realize or notice is that one of the things that stuck out in your article was that you said, according to the CIES Football Observatory, Dinamo Zagreb have produced the third highest number of professional players, 71, currently playing in Europe's top divisions, which is sort of similar levels to your Real Madrid's, the Castilla there, the Barcelona's La Masia, Ajax's de Toekomst, Benfica's Seixal academies. In terms of talent production, this is kind of one of the European hotbeds, which certainly does not get the credit that I think as you mentioned, perhaps the more Western ones do. And I think one thing I do want to say on that is that granted, this is partly down to Croatia has a population of around 4 million. And it's partly down to sort of the funneling of the best young players in Croatia going to Dinamo. But you need to have that infrastructure in place in order to develop the players who then go on to become World Cup finalists, of course. The story of Croatia, going toe to toe with France in that World Cup final, the 4-2 defeat in 2018 is a fascinating one. Of course, beating England in the semi-final, a country with massive resources. But that was the one thing that stuck out to me. I think from your learning of Dinamo Zagreb, Ben, what was it about the youth production, the youth talent side of things that was there anything in particular which was kind of really really stand out?
I think what I was really surprised by is that in the UEFA Youth League tournament, both in 2019 and 2020, they made it to the quarterfinals, which I wasn't. It kind of just passed me by really, but they finished above Man City in the group stages. They finished above Man City in the 1920 UEFA Youth season, and they actually beat Bayern Munich as well before they lost to Benfica. And then in the 18-19 season, they beat Liverpool, and they only lost to Chelsea on penalties, who were Chelsea, I think, ended up winning the tournament that year. So I think that was kind of fascinating to see that, as well as developing these world-class players who've played at Champions League finals. So, for example, I think since the Manchester United Barcelona Champions League final in 2011, every single World Cup, every single Champions League final since then has featured a Croatian, and it's mostly been from Dinamo Zagreb's academy. So the likes of Mandzukić, Modrić, Lovren, Mateo Kovačić, or Ivica Olic. And then on top of that, well, Rakitic and Perisic, who didn't come through Dinamo Zagreb's academy, but still Croatian. So it was just fascinating how you don't really notice it, but Croatia is actually a big sort of power. And I mean, I guess the 2018 World Cup proves that they have real quality.
Yeah, I think a lot of the time, people kind of think, oh, yeah, in Croatia, they're obviously a very good team, but I think they might neglect to realize that it is, as I mentioned earlier, a country of, only a few million people. It's very similar to how Uruguay has a very, very small population in South America, but has been something of a footballing powerhouse in terms of the players they've produced. The likes of your Edinson Cavani's, your Diego Forlan, Luis Suarez, of course. These players, and not just the attackers. The likes of Walter Gargano, Enzo Perez, those types of more destructive defensive midfielders. There's a nice spread of talent there, and I think it's very similar with Croatia as well. But in terms of that World Cup final we were talking about, one of the other things that I picked out of your piece, kind of cherry picked, was that 14 players in Croatia's 2018 World Cup final squad had either come through Dinamo's youth system or represented the club at some point prior to the game versus France, which was a World Cup record. Which in this day and age, you think is if this was the 1930 or 1938 World Cup final, perhaps that might have been a bit more prominent because one club would have had so much dominance. But no, that is the record for the World Cup finals. Of having the most players from a single club, or to have had as much one club having had as much influence as Dinamo Zagreb. So that is, I mean, that again, we've spent the first 10 minutes or so here kind of just stressing how impactful Dinamo Zagreb has been on Croatian football and European football, of course. But in terms of in terms of sort of building a reputation, we had probably the most high profile player at that club in the past few years, especially from sort of a Western perspective, hasn't even been a Croatian. It was Dani Olmo, who's obviously a Spanish international now, but he left La Masia, Barcelona's famed academy, for Zagreb in 2014 when he was just 16 years old. How do you go about luring? I mean, you'll know this because you spoke to Romeo Jozak, but how do you go about luring a player who, by all accounts, was a very talented player in Barcelona's academy to Croatia? It's not exactly a well trodden path, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it kind of stems from probably a decade before that, when Dinamo and Romeo Jozak in particular came to the club and decided to make a lot of radical changes. Firstly, and that was after you've had the likes of Modrić, Kranjčar, Eduardo, Olic, and Chorluka and Mandzukić come through. But even so, I think the reason why those players ended up at Dinamo is, like you said, is because Dinamo kind of hold hegemony in the region, and all the best players kind of come there. But then in 2007, the academy sort of developed a very unique and successful system, and one that doesn't just get the best players, but it makes sure those players go to the top clubs and perform at an elite level. And all that started in 2007.
So, in terms of going back to sort of around that time, and one thing that we've looked at sort of in the prep for this was sort of historic squads, and this was actually a really fun endeavor for somebody like me who likes to think that they probably know a little bit about football, but going and finding something out which was completely just unbeknown to me. And around that time, around 2007, this was essentially before those radical changes came in play. The 06-07 season, Dinamo Zagreb, they won the Croatian title, surprise, surprise. But they won it in style with 30 games won, 2 drawn, one lost. you had a 20-year-old Vedran Choluka, who we've discussed, 20-year-old Luka Modrić, who's a name who won't need much introduction to most people, but also 17-year-old Milan Badel, who has been at Fiorentina and Genoa in Serie A for the past decade or so. And also 23-year-old Eduardo da Silva, who was probably best known as Eduardo in English football, famous for the horrific leg break that he suffered while playing for Arsenal. But prior to that move, he scored 34 goals that season in the Croatian First League. So that was a monumental effort. But, this going back even further, there was the 2002-2003 squad, which had, again, some very familiar names, but at the time when they would have been scouted football players, essentially. So, Eduardo back then was 19. That's when he sort of started to come through with Dinamo. But he also had 17-year-old Niko Kranjčar, who, of course, has been a household name over the past sort of 10 years with Spurs and Portsmouth in the Premier League. But also Ivica Olic, who was 22 at the time, was the league's top goal scorer that season. And I thought that was really intriguing that this club, the further you go back, constantly there's just a rich youth footballing heritage, which clearly, as we've discussed about the UEFA Youth League campaigns, has been carried on in recent times. But was there anything about sort of the historic squads for you, Ben, that was like when you were doing your research or anything like that, where you thought, this is actually really cool? Because that was essentially what I was getting from going back through them on Transfermarkt, just looking down, scanning the names and going, oh, I recognize him. And I was like, oh, there's quite a squad here.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, even just like recent, not that historic, but like, the fact that Brozović was there, I thought that was cool, and Kovačić at the same time. That there's been in the 2010s loads of interesting squads, and I think what those really early squads, I think what they did was, like you said, created that sort of youth culture, as it wherein Dinamo would play those youngsters, and then around that, Romeo came in and he decided to create a sort of structure to it as well to make it more successful. And I think for me, in terms of the changes, I feel like it's important to address the radical changes that we discussed. And when Romeo came in, he actually fired 20 to 25 coaches at the academy, which is a big overhaul. And he hired 32 new coaches in their place. And as much as how well run the club is and all the drills and the sort of program that they have set up, I think what the most important thing that I got from Romeo when I asked him about the secrets to Dinamo's success is he talked about mentality a lot. So when he was first sort of setting up this academy system, he would travel around Croatia, all over the place, scouting for coaches, and he'd often watch them from his car, and like making sure that they had the right mentality and the right sort of profile for what he was looking for. And he even told me sometimes, they didn't have like the highest UEFA badges or the UEFA badges that you would normally require to work at a club like Dinamo Zagreb. But because he saw potential in them, he decided to give them a chance because they offered something different or something that was in line with his philosophy. And whilst they were working, they were actually getting their badges whilst they were working at the club. And I think mentality is something that Dinamo Zagreb are very keen on, even in terms of player identification. They like players, as Romeo would put it, who dive headfirst at the ball, and will play with their blood, sweat, and tears. And I think a lot of the successful players that we mentioned are kind of like that. Your Modric's, your Kovacic's, and your Cholukas. They're kind of players who have that mentality and will do anything to win.
Yeah, the win at all costs mentality, I think, is something which you hear in interviews with players, with managers, with people who've been successful in the game, and you do. It is a common theme, and I think a lot of the time you do get mentality floated around as a buzzword of sorts, but there must be something behind it to say that it is actually something which matters an awful lot, especially at this younger side of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important sort of comparison. So when I spoke to Romeo, he said Luka Modrić didn't actually stand out that much in at academy football. But whereas someone like Alan Halilovic, who he worked with a lot, stood out a lot. And he said Alan Halilovic at any age could do whatever he wanted on the pitch, and he was just incredible. And people back then were calling him, the Croatian Messi.
Yeah.
And he got, I think Barcelona were kind of looking to even replace him like replace Messi with him. And he's someone, on the flip side of the coin, who maybe probably didn't have the right mentality or the right psychological environment to make the next step up. Maybe, he probably made the wrong choice as well by moving to such a big club at such a young age. It was such a big step up from Dinamo Zagreb. So yeah, I think that's like a interesting comparison to make.
The inverted Dani Olmo move, essentially, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.